panel discussion which takes place on this historic day with the latest building in the college's collection work of architecture. The reason we put the panel together is to explore the context in which this new building sits. And I'll invite the various panellists. First, Mark Goldie, who is a professor of history in the faculty here in Cambridge, to introduce the architectural programme from the very outset. Then we'll move to Professor Marcial Echenique, who is Emeritus Professor of Architecture and former head of the Department of Architecture here in Cambridge, to tell us about the buildings that came after the original Shepherd-Robson scheme. Marcial has played an implicit part in the college's architectural history course. Then Minna Sunikka will very kindly, Minna is, of course, a lecturer in the Department of Architecture here. Minna will talk about the competition that was organised to design the new court and why ultimately Tom Emerson won the competition with 6A architects. Tom, who is Professor of Architecture at ETH in Zurich and a founding member with Stephanie of 6A Architects, ultimately won the competition and will try and tell us about how he interpreted this history and how it shaped the building that we have today. It goes without saying that because this panel discussion is being recorded, if I could ask everyone to turn off their mobile phone, that would be very helpful indeed. But let me just introduce Mark, first of all, to talk about the history of the college's architecture.
Thank you, Barry. When we look at our buildings, they seem very familiar to us. Of course, that is because we are mostly members of this college. But they're familiar because we think of them as characteristic of 60s architecture. So what we have to do is imagine again the shock of the new. Because these buildings were the first major essay in modernist architecture in collegiate Cambridge after the Second World War. They were quite dramatic in their impact architecturally and in a presence in an ancient university like Cambridge. Until this building came along, until the competition to design this building, Cambridge architecture had been pretty traditional. This is what I call post-war boring. I'm not going to say where it is, some of you may know. But until about 1960, virtually everything that was built in collegiate Cambridge was sedate, neo-Georgian, or of some such ilk. We weren't quite the very first, it has to be said. A very brave thing was done, brave because it's right on the river. This is the Erasmus building at Queen's College, 1958, designed by Basil Spence, who was probably in 1958 the most famous architect in the country because of Coventry Cathedral, a building which made modern architecture acceptable to a much wider population. And it is characteristic, of course, of a quite new approach to architecture with its strong horizontals, its flat roof, and the telltale raising of the building on pilotti. Then there's a fascinating little building, the extension to the architecture department, 1959, designed by Colin St. John Wilson, Sandy Wilson, who soon became the first fellow in architecture of this college, and went on later to design the British Library at King's Cross. Now, this is a deliberately very crude and unfinished building designed to allow architecture students to think about the structure of building. And it's one of the earliest reflections of late Corbusier in England. There was a huge and sudden fashion after the mid-1950s for a little set of residential buildings designed by Le Corbusier in Paris, with a characteristic combination of concrete horizontal floors with brick as well, this combination of brick and concrete. This is crude, as was Corbusier's own version. What the English architects as a whole would do is produce much more svelte, smooth versions of this. Now, the key thing about the Churchill competition This is a very early photograph, obviously. The key thing about Churchill was that it was a competition. It was a competition that admitted to higher education all the great modernist teams of architects which in the 1950s had been busy building the welfare state, the schools, the public housing projects, and so forth. But what they wanted to do was to gain an entree into the building of universities. It was a competition for 20 people, of which 4 were shortlisted. Every single one of them was a modernist architect. And there's a story to be told as to why that was, because certainly Winston Churchill wanted something neoclassical. Doubtless he dreamt of Blenheim Palace as some sort of model. But a man called Leslie Martin, the first professor of architecture in Cambridge, appointed in 1956, ran rings around the college and its trustees and ensured that every single one of the competitors was a modernist. He was a great disher out of patronage, the strings of patronage in the 50s and the 60s. And I tend to think that because of this competition, what was not built at Churchill was as important as what was, because many of the schemes that were unsuccessful were reused. Architects hate to spoil a good scheme, we'll take it elsewhere. And so many of the buildings for the new universities of the 1960s, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, so on, were upshots of designs first initiated in the competition here. Indeed, some of the unsuccessful versions ended up fairly much as they might have been here at such places as St Anne's College, Oxford. Now, Elaine Harwood has called this probably, therefore, the most important architectural competition in England in the post-war era. And I do recommend her wonderful book. It's the heaviest book I've ever bought, £9, and it's her new book on English architecture since the war. She loves this college, and there's a lovely 2-page spread showing illustration of our wonderful dining hall. So this was an entry point for the modernists. There were 20 submissions, and it was a golden opportunity for people to be utopian. Some people built pavilions in the park, some people highly dense urban structures, some even proposed high-rise tower blocks with the thought of a master's lodge in the penthouse at the very top with fine views of Cambridge. But the 4 that were shortlisted were these, and this is Chamberlain, Powell and Bonn, who at the same time were building the Barbican, and you can see some similarities with the Barbican, the arches there, this extraordinary bell tower in the middle. They had the bright idea of uniting Fitzwilliam, New Hall and Churchill in this great piazza. And I particularly like these dons here with mortarboard looking out over this extraordinary creation. By far the most megalomaniac proposal, and the one that has been most frequently illustrated ever since, is by James Stirling and Gowan. And because there's a great cult, which I never understand myself, of Stirling, this is often reproduced. It puts the whole college in one gigantic courtyard, far bigger than the courtyard of Trinity College, Cambridge. That is the whole distance from Madingley Road across the site. Raised on an earthwork platform and then with these great towers inside. Here's the college library. This was easily the most, if you like, aggressive of the proposals and therefore was bound not to win. But those who know Stirling will immediately see what he later built using this kind of... Now, this image I absolutely love. It's the design that is often called the runner-up, and it's by Howell Killigan Partridge. John Partridge just died, very great age, the other day. And it's an incredibly seductive image, which I think brilliantly combines the modernistic with the traditional and humanistic, if you like. These stunningly modern buildings with their CPP's telltale concrete pods for their windows there. There's even a jet aircraft streaking across the sky. But look, there's a student sitting on the lawn in the middle over a book. There's an artificial lake with punters there. We have swans. And here, on this island, Sir Winston was to be buried. What we got was something of a compromise, which on the one hand has elements of what we think of as the brutalism, the name coined in the 1960s, concrete brutalism, and this plus the chimney stack is our most striking essay, if you like, in concrete brutalism, and there's plenty of evidence of that, these wonderfully over-engineered staircases that we have, great chunky sculptural use of concrete, the characteristic shutterboarding, board-marked concrete. You can tell the exact date of a building within a decade in Britain. Anything from 1958 to 68, roughly, is the period of that use of concrete. And we're surely the only Oxbridge College whose foundation stone is not a stone, that is cast in concrete. Soaring monumentality in the dining hall, and yet a wonderful ability to create domestic spaces. And Shepherd had a great feel for texture, for surfaces, whether it's in the use of brick or the wonderful use of wood throughout the college. It was called by one of the critics the Blenheim of the welfare state. Now, my last thought is about, and it's something I think we'll come back to, is about the evolution of projects, because as any architect will know, what you win, the image you win with, particularly in a competition, is unlikely to be the finished project. And the evolution of Shepherd's project was quite dramatic indeed. This is an early perspective, along with the set that you saw earlier from the original competition. And it's quite unlike what eventually appeared. The whole of the central block of buildings was entirely remodelled to create the dining hall. And at this point, he hadn't yet decided to punch out all of the windows into oriel windows, creating the very, if you like, syncopated surfaces that run all through the building. Those were later decisions. And the final image, which I also like very much, is the earliest model of the building. He was into courtyard-itis in a big way, and certainly felt that he won the competition because of the commitment to the tradition of courtyards and staircases. This is a traditional college with a modern dress, if you like. But the original intention was 20 courtyards. The college insisted on enlarging the size of the courtyards, therefore reducing the numbers. And then we ran out of money, so that the west end was never completed. And we're all glad of that. We would never now enclose our west end as intended here. But quickly notice the other features. These buildings become entirely different in the design process. Statue of Winston in the middle. And lastly, what is this great oblong rectangle at the beginning? That is the chapel. But that is another story. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Marcial, could I invite you to talk about how we...
Well, good afternoon. I would just say a few words about the development of the college since the original competition and the original building. And as you know, every institution evolves through time, and Churchill is not an exception of that. Originally, the college was really guided to undergraduates, which was the typical college of Cambridge. And you realize that this part, which is the original part, is essentially an undergraduate area. But as you know, the university has evolved, and practically no more undergraduates, constant numbers, has been over the last decade, and is projected in the future as no more increase in undergraduate. But yes, enormous increase in terms of postgraduates, and that's the fastest part of the university growth. So this college evolved into admitting more postgraduates, and therefore changing the nature of the accommodation of the college. And finally, we do have the fastest growth of individuals in Cambridge to do with postdoctoral and beyond that. You know, a lot of people involved in research and around the university. And we are moving towards that to accommodate those people, which are very much an important part of the university. So we do see this evolution of the university, and Churchill in particular. This is the undergraduate part that on the top was built just after the finish of the first part for the Wolfson Court, essentially for graduates. And beyond that, we have all the so-called pepper pots, which are a village of graduate students. And the biggest intervention has been the Minna Center, which is beyond the postgraduates for people who come as continuous education, a conference and so on. So it has been adapting over the years to accommodate that. Not only in the terms of the housing part or the dwelling part, but also we have had enormous changes through the time in terms of administration, new needs and new things. And amongst them, the biggest part has been the archive, first done in the 1960s, it was 1970, and then the expansion to accommodate the papers of Mrs. Thatcher, Lady Thatcher. So that has been enormous increase. Also has been substantial increases in terms of administration and famously the chapel, which is not here, but is beyond. Maybe deliberately, I don't know. So originally, the chapel was supposed, in the second stage, was supposed to be here. And it hasn't happened, and there's a big gap. Now, this has been the evolution of the college, which has been very, very successful because we do have a very large space, and it was great to have that. But the structure, and now I'm talking about the design and building. I mean, Mark has given a very good lecture on which an architect should be proud of it. But anyway, I'm just jumping to the kind of formation of the building. Essentially, the undergraduates are around court and around stairs, which is the traditional way of handling the planning of that. So the new building, which Tom will be talking about, followed that pattern by creating exactly the same size of square for undergraduates. But the difference is that the structure is not based on stairs now because of the need for disabled people to access every room. So we do have corridor, which is very unheard of in Cambridge colleges, but it's essentially a modern change. From the planning point of view, the original scheme had a spine here, which contained most of the public buildings, the communal building, the entrance, Porter's Lodge, admin, the dining hall, library, and so on. This was supposed to be the center of the college, and around that, the courtyard for undergraduates. But through the time, as the evolution of the college in terms of postgraduate accommodation and new development there and the Miller Center is changing the structure of the college, and this road, the private road, service road, has become the spine of the college now, which is very different from the original one here, is that it has become very, very important. And maybe in the future, that will be the main spine of the college. And we do have a clever system, which you shouldn't repeat, to acquire the gardens of those houses. So eventually we'll be able to build it. Of course, you shouldn't repeat that because the planning office will get absolutely furious about that. But I think essentially in the future we ought to improve that road to accommodate more development because that is the main axis of the road. Finally, I will say a few things about the detailed design of the college. During that period, in the 1950s, Cobb, the Corbusier, was very much in fashion, and Cobb had this principle of the pilotis, which the building raised above the ground, so we have free landscape underneath. We didn't do it here as much as that, but it was full of pilotis everywhere. So huge wind will go through these corridors, and really it was difficult to go from the porter's lodge into the hall, being blown through the underneath the building. So I proposed that we should close that. And we put quite a lot of accommodation there, and it has looked all right. And then a lot of pilotis, which are this column, were filled in by the previous Batu master by adding rooms in there, because it was already the floor, the ceiling, and it was very easy to put some room. But leaving gaps to see through, but not all of them open, which I think also improved. And I think Tom has done very cleverly, built the courtyard up to the ground, rather than leaving so many open gaps, which are really very difficult to handle. So the evolution of the college in terms of strategy is that it's been developed around that edge and more reaching to the ground, which I think Tom's building is really the right answer to that. So I will leave it to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcial. So I'll invite Minna now to talk about how we, literally and metaphorically, build on the architecture that's been so well established, and how we choose and select the architects to build a new court.
Thank you. So I thought I'd say, before Tom starts to explain more about the building, just a few words about why we chose this proposal, because it was quite a long process. I think we started to think of the competition first in 2007. We had it in 2008. I think we wanted to complete by 2011, so the whole process was delayed a bit, as it usually happens. So I will just show you a few other proposals that were alternatives to the 6A project. So first of all, we of course wanted to invite Shepard Robson, who's the architect of the original college buildings, to see how they would actually extend the current building. So you perhaps see in this slide, these two small cubes here. So this was actually what they proposed in the first stage of the competition to do. And the idea was that they would be clad in this kind of green wall. So basically two compact cube-like volumes with the green wall, but we were not very impressed by this proposal. And then a lot of other competition entries were more going towards kind of linear volumes. This is the RHM architects who have done the music center/study center. You see it on Churchill Road. And that was the proposal with these three slender buildings with slightly tilted roofs. And maybe the advantage of that was that it actually included all the student rooms were facing north and south, so you'd actually get light from both sides. And then the communal spaces, like kitchens, would all be in the ground floor. But we felt it was quite an open solution. So you would see on the left side you have the tennis courts, on the right side you have the existing college buildings. And another similar proposal by Cotterill Vermeulen architects, but on a different direction. So Cotterill Vermeulen have done the Pepper Potts buildings behind the Wolfson Flats, our graduate housing, and are currently working with us on another project as well. We're planning to extend that part of the college for graduate housing. So that's an office which has always very strong landscape concept, as you could see in the Pepper Potts as well, where the orchard idea works very well. So what they proposed to do was, you see the existing courtyards there, to have these three new buildings and then enclose a kind of informal garden between the existing college buildings and between the sports field. And I think they also, they proposed to relocate the sports pavilion here, and that would be almost like the main space where all the rooms would be facing. And they also had a very good detailed proposal about the communal spaces. So again, like I think fantastic office, but we felt it was not quite right for the site. We then invited 3 other architects to be in the second stage of the competition. One of them, Field and Clegg Bradley, who have done also like award-winning apartment schemes in Accordia, for example. An office which is very well profiled with sustainable building. I think also Peter Clegg was an old student of Marcial. And they did also, you see, the typology studies. So that was the approach of a lot of practices, some of them with the final proposal, some of them presented a list of alternatives of either going more like linear stair groups. The middle one is a kind of compact building, which of course would mean also that maybe the building would be taller, the footprint is slightly smaller. And then a kind of courtyard solution on the left side, where they actually propose to use an existing court to enclose that courtyard. And they did some illustrations as well. So that would be, it's not, the top one is the kind of computer-generated image of that proposal, although it doesn't seem very accurate. So as you see, like compared to 6A proposal, it is very open still. We perhaps felt also the materiality concept felt a bit corporate, like compared to what we felt we wanted to have in the college. And then that was, for example, the illustration of the most compact solution. So you would have this kind of tower. So I don't think it would ever get through the planners these days, or the neighbors, but like a very different kind of option. Like, despite my best efforts, and especially Jennifer's very organized archives, we couldn't find any examples of the one proposal which was especially exciting. That was by a Dutch office called MVRTV, like a very innovative office with bold concepts. And they actually proposed a kind of opposite of this solution. So they wanted to sink the whole building underground. So they proposed a kind of like a round-shaped building, almost like a donut shape, that would all be underground. So you would not be able to see it from the sports fields. So it would actually kind of preserve the green space. But that would have the disadvantage that all the student rooms would actually kind of face the inner courtyard, which is underground. And we thought, like from building point of view, there might be risks with that as well. And I think the costing, it was by far the most expensive proposal. They also didn't, again, had a kind of material view of the building, which we think is very important part of what makes the existing college buildings so attractive. And I think that's the model what Tom and Stephanie presented in their final competition meeting. So you see the building has changed a lot since the first competition entry. So in the first instance, it had these balconies on the exterior facade, but I think that was kind of thought it wouldn't maybe be appropriate to the student room needs and disappeared quite early in the project. And also what you can see from the inner courtyard, although I remember the model already had at that stage that wonderful birch forest inside, so we have kept that. But there was a bigger variety in the student rooms. So there were much more room typologies. There were double height spaces, there were mezzanines, and that also would reflect in slightly different facade. But like what Marcial was saying, then of course because of this accessibility compliance, we just could not have lift in every staircase. So it's kind of ended up to be in a kind of gallery space inside, so you could just access all the rooms, and that kind of reflected on how the rooms were designed. And I remember the housekeeping was not very excited about having beds to be done in mezzanine and all that. But altogether, I would say, I think for myself there were two main things why we chose this proposal. What have been mentioned many times already was that it felt like it would really belong to college with the courtyard footprint, like a very contextual response. I think it's even an improvement in that way because of the gallery space that it introduces, which is kind of the circulation space for students. It has a beautiful light, it's very well proportioned. And we hope the students will actually start to occupy the window sills also in the corridor. Because if you talk to the existing students in the college now, if they have one complaint about the existing college building, is that it's actually, especially for the less sociable ones, they feel it's a very lonely existence. So you would go to your room, you go to the chip room, and there's not kind of, the staircases don't invite you to stay there. So I think it will be so interesting when the new students will actually move into that building in a couple of weeks. How will they actually use that gallery space? Might become very popular part of the college. And maybe as a second feature, what I really liked about the building in the beginning already is the very strong material feeling. It has a full timber structure, and also the cladding, the details, is like a very beautiful use of timber in a very unapologetic way, because I come from Finland myself, and I think in the Scandinavia we use timber in a very different way than in this country, where the timber buildings tend to be quite often very vernacular, like very modest, apologetic, kind of buildings you see when you go to National Trust properties. And I think this building is very different take on that, which is absolutely fantastic. So we're very happy with that, I think, since the first proposal. And I would really compliment also like Tom and Stefani and the team that despite all the evolution that the building has gone through, it has still kept very much the strong character what it had in the beginning. So the facades may have changed, the room typologies may have changed, but it's still very much what we ordered in the first instance. And I would also say that I think it will be much appreciated in the architect circles, because already now 6A will have their own El Croquis number, and for non-architects you could say that El Croquis is a journal which would be equivalent to Nature in the science world, so we're very proud of that. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom, it's over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Minna. This actually is the very first time since 2008 that I've ever seen our competitors. So I sort of feel like I should be given a few minutes to recalibrate my talk. I feel like the story needs to be slightly rewritten now. It's a slightly unusual thing for us to talk about the building when we have just been to see the building, because it means, apart from anything else, I can't make any false claims for it. So all I can do is I'd like to show maybe a few, in fact, I was asked to show a few things that influenced the design, a few references, maybe things that inspired us. And I'll start here with this photograph in February 2008, our first site visit, looking across a very kind of Cambridge, misty winter morning, which is incredibly beautiful. I was a student here, not in Churchill, but just down the road in Leckhampton, which has a very similar landscape, and it's something that was very striking. And of course, the building, the edge of the building on the corner there, I actually studied in the building that Mark showed, the School of Architecture. So this was sort of slightly in our blood, and we were all educated by that generation of modernists, people like Smithson, and so a lot of this, the DNA of Churchill was kind of already with us. But really, the single most important reference and inspiration for us was the college, the people and the architecture of the college. And that's run for the last 8 years with, in a really super interesting, challenging, inspiring way. So the starting point for us was the courtyard. I mean, as Mark has already described, the college had courtyarditis. But this, we thought, was the building block of the college. And that what we would try to do is see what the 21st century would have to say about the post-war court. So Cowan Court is exactly the same in plan, dimensions in plan as the original college. On the left is the original court. On the right is Cowan Court. It's the same dimension externally, same dimension internally, and 3 stories. The question is where do you go from there? The first big difference, I don't know if this has a pointer on it. Or does this? Yeah. The first difference is in the room orientation. So one of the elements was the fact that Cowan Court sits in a kind of landscape setting rather than in a kind of more urban, sort of dense thing. And we thought, let's put all the rooms facing outwards. So all the rooms are on the perimeter. We had noticed in the original courts that sometimes you get these inward-facing rooms where you get the bay windows looking into one another. And every time we came to visit, there would always be the same two with their curtains drawn. And there was a slight, although the spaces are very, very nice, it's a beautifully made building, there were these little issues that we thought in this more open setting around the fields we could address. And then that would mean that we would have essentially a horizontal, there would no longer be the staircase, there are two stairs, one lift, and essentially the staircase model becomes a kind of cloister model. That is essentially the big difference. So it was really about this idea of a kind of doppelganger that would belong to the college, absolutely emphatically, but then what would it be 50 years later? And of course, we felt we had some license that in Shepherd Robson's scheme, they were reinterpreting essentially the ancient model that had defined the university anyway. So it is an evolving type. The primary difference then, or the primary architectural difference, that we would go from a mineral building, kind of concrete and brick, a building that's really of the earth, to an organic one. And that was a big step in terms of character, in terms of atmosphere, but also in terms of energy use, in terms of what the big issues are of 21st century architecture in relation to energy, and see to what extent could we make a timber building behave like a Churchill building. And so one of the first things was this very striking articulation of every story height with the concrete band. And here, I'll show it a little bit more in a moment, we did it as a cut in the facade. So it's what was a concrete band in the original buildings is now just a shadow in the new ones. The other thing that we were interested in was what happens when a building which is part of a system, essentially of big courts, smaller courts, is a standalone building in the landscape. And that, we felt, is a much more subjective judgment, but to slightly distort the overall square shape, to give it this very slight curve, which is almost like a kind of receiving of the open landscape, a kind of like a sort of residual crescent. This model, incidentally, is made of oak and was made by a chap called Adam Willis, who is part of Assemble, who I believe is going to be working with the college in the future. So there's a little continuity there. So this is what I mean by the building being essentially a landscape building rather than an urban building once it's at this end of the court. And the groundworks department very kindly put a tractor in there to illustrate my point. It's not quite as agricultural as that, but nevertheless, its relationship is one towards an open landscape rather than a kind of an urban centre. There you see it again as a sort of more of a landscape building than one linked to the existing quads. So this is one of two references, one of the two only references that are outside of Churchill. And on the right is Paycock House in Coggeshall in Essex, which I think, in my view, is the finest timber frame building in England. And one of the key characteristics of it, apart from the regularity of the framework, the way that the windows and the frames work, is the jettying, the projection of one story above another, mainly to protect the beams from driving rain when structure was exposed. Of course, now you can't expose structure to the elements because of cold bridging, but the articulation and that sense of depth in a facade through the jettying was very important to us. And the building is, like Paycock Hall, a timber frame. It's a series of posts and beams made in glulam, laminated softwood made in Germany, after some essentially digital fabrication, digital modelling, digital fabrication, and then brought to site and assembled very quickly. So it has a very particular structural order, which is one thing stacking on the next. Now, of course, that doesn't belong only to timber buildings. In fact, it's a structural approach that you can find everywhere in the original college. So there is, near the entrance to the college, you see the double concrete beam. And so what we wanted to do was to try and recover and reuse some of the motifs, some of the textures, some of the structural principles of the original building. So there is the corner, the southwest corner of Cowan Court and near the entrance. You will notice in the lining, in the materials, they're generally treatments that you will find in different forms in different parts of the college. So to some extent, although the building as a timber building is the opposite of a post-war brutalist building, in many respects it has a great deal in common. And what is shuttered concrete if not solidified timber anyway? Here are a couple of pictures when we were doing the material exploration, when essentially the idea that timber would be the opposite of Cambridge, of Churchill. Timber would actually be a very close alignment in texture, in scale, even in colour. So we have the concrete, the shuttered concrete on the left and the Staffordshire brick on the right. So far from being the opposite, it became much closer. And these are a couple of pictures from a couple of weeks ago where even, let's say, the kind of earthy colours of the reclaimed oak cladding are actually very close to some of the brickwork. The oak cladding is not concrete. It is very old oak. This is a picture of a freight train, actually in New Jersey. I saw this documentary last night. I thought, finally, I've got a picture of where this comes from. The boardings are essentially the deck of freight trains that travelled throughout Europe. So in fact, my colleague Cécile found them in France, a huge pile of it, I think about 8,000 square meters. They went to see it, investigated it, tested it, and then we brought it to the college. And I must say that the college was fantastic in its appetite for innovation and trying a new way of using this timber, which is very good quality. And also, it is sort of pre-aged, and now will start toning down, being a little bit more silvery. Even the south facade, you can already see, is slightly more silvery than the others. But essentially, it's, I hope, maybe the first 21st century brutalist building, the first timber brutalist building. But in the best sense of the word, brute, as Le Corbusier used it, as in pure. He meant it in the same way that we call champagne brute, as in really pure, not as in something aggressive. So I hope that it's a building that will be warm and welcoming to its residents. Other motifs, once we were within the design process, so things like the fenestration, which is essentially a pattern that wraps around the building, but then rearranged on the corners, and actually echoes in some respects the sort of the irregular composition of the original ones. And even the kind of characteristic bay window and the window seat. Cowan Court is super insulated, which means that we have very deep walls, and then that we could put the window seat within the depth of the fabric. So even that element, I hope, will be recognisable. The specimen trees, which define many of the courts of the original one, we sort of decided to bunch them together, to densify them in a kind of woodland in the centre, and slightly invert the type. So we have open fields around the building, in the playing fields, tennis courts, and then a dense woodland, which hopefully will become quite an intimate social space for the students living there. The trees are still small, but they will grow fast. And we hope that in summer it will provide a lot of shade, a nice place to read, and so on. And then in winter, as a deciduous, they will open up to the sky, letting more light into the quad. The court is lined in oak, in fresh oak, with these, which you'll notice in the plan, there's this slight stepping in the sequence of doors. We were really keen that the building has corners. People meet at corners. People do not meet along flat walls. And that although they're quite subtle, it gives every door, every room, its own little patch of wall where you can access the rooms. We've put the rainwater on the outside of the building. I think we had heard a few reports from the original college and trouble with that. And then it brings all the rainwater into the court, so everything to do with the weather comes in there. It flows into the gullies that you see there, into an underground storage tank to be reused for irrigation. And then leaving the building, you can see through the oak-lined cloister to the great willow tree beyond, the willow tree and the walnut tree, which were there. This is a photograph again in 2008. They've been sort of watching over the site over the last few years, seeing the whole thing kind of emerge. And now all that's missing, I think, is the students who will arrive next week, and I hope that they will make it a full member of Churchill College. Thank you.